We are going to talk with the team that went on a 2-year journey to bring Google Earth to VR. So this is the first and only virtual reality application that lets you freely explore the world, as you got to see in the video. So since launching, the app has been downloaded over 370,000 times. That was on Steam, correct? So we have with us Adam Glazier, who's the UX lead at Google. We have Andre Lee, product designer and VR prototyper, and Nadav Ashkenazi, VR software engineer. So welcome.
Thank you.
Maybe we can start by, can you guys kind of set the scene for us? Like, what was the inspiration for this project? And is this the first time that Google Earth has been brought to VR?
Yes, I can talk to that. One of the first demos for Google Cardboard was Earth VR. You'd see a globe and you'd fly into Street View. And that was one of the things that inspired Sundar to pull the plug and launch it at I.O. That was epic. Didn't think I'd have a backing track. And then shortly after that, we got the We could talk about Tilbrush too. It's a cool app. So shortly after the cardboard thing, we got Earth VR, or Earth, running on a DK2, and we had a leap motion, and we used our hands to kind of like fly like a bird around the planet. And so that's when we realized that like this content was meant to be seen in 3D, right? Like we all had it on our phones and our desktops before that, but you really like, there's just no explaining like the difference of being in it versus seeing it on your computer. And I think it was the first time I realized like, oh, this is actually like amazing data. Versus on the computer, it was like, all I ever used it for was like finding hiking trails or something simple like that.
So how did you ultimately settle on the mode through which an individual could experience this world? I know there were some challenges around where the person is positioned in the space, and the kind of experiences and perceptual challenges that had.
So your question is like, how did we settle on how they get around the different modes?
You mentioned, they're right now they're stationary in this world. There are a bunch of options where you give them complete mobility where they can essentially fly across every dimension. So what kind of experimentation happened before landing on where you guys landed?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when we started, there was the only good example of getting around a VR app was teleporting. You point somewhere and you end up there, and that's really problematic. Users would teleport somewhere, and on a place like Earth, they'd be at the top of a mountain all of a sudden, and they'd be looking around like trying to get their bearings because they lost context. They went from way over there to here, and that's just something that most people have a hard time with. So. We started slow and asked people what they wanted and gave them what they wanted and realized that wasn't working. Because if you give someone everything they want, you end up with a bunch of controls.
There's also I think people look at movies like Superman and stuff like that and expect it to be able to fly. You put your hands forward and stuff like that. But there's also the fatigue, right? Ergonomics have a big factor, play a big factor in this the design of this, so that you might not be able to lift your arms as high as you would want to, or you might get really tired putting your hands up in the air. So what we ended up on was something that was comfortable for kind of a wide variety of people.
So how many of these, where you landed on this through VR, how many of these are known challenges for VR, and how many of these are kind of unique to your experience or this specific project?
Well, I think getting around a planet is unique. I haven't seen many VR apps do that. There are a few, but they don't go to the granular level of detail to like a street. They're more just like surfing through astral bodies. So I think I think it was particularly hard because people have an expectation of what Earth looks like and feels like, and the scale of things matters. Versus in a game, you can get away with a lot, right? Like people don't understand how big things are or how things should look. So we had to do a lot of work to try and reconcile, like, you know, for instance, like when someone changes when they go higher up into the air, their feet are actually still on the ground, which means they're this enormous giant. But most people don't even realize that that's happening, even though that is what's, you know, happening. So we like took some liberties, but ultimately like aimed to try and make it feel as natural as possible.
In some of the videos that you shared, they're both on YouTube. I think they're on YouTube as well. Through some of the user research, you had to deal with a lot of issues around vertigo through your user research. Can you talk about your user research process and some of the experiences that some of the participants had navigating some of the more experimental kinds of approaches?
Sure, I can talk about that. So, I mean, early in our design process, like Adam said, we just tried lots and lots of different things, and we ran through cognitive walkthroughs with people that work in VR but not on Google Earth VR, and we've actually had to identify some people that were susceptible to kind of like motion sickness and simulation sickness, and use those people as kind of like this benchmark early on in our designs to decide whether or not we should even continue, you know, pursuing this. But really, you know, once we productionize something, once we kind of like really roll it out, we usability test this with external participants. Something that's interesting about usability testing in VR is that there's kind of this confluence between the wow factor of VR. So if you haven't tried VR before, you're wowed by the technology, the immersion, all of that. But then there's also the aspect that we actually really want to study, which is this simulation sickness. So we tend to actually introduce people to VR, to the platform, well before we actually throw them into Google Earth VR. So we kind of separate those two things.
Okay. Where is your favorite place to go on Google Earth VR?
Do you remember the name of that place in Spain? That like plateau?
No, it's not Monterey.
No. Anyway, but I guess I always end up going home, and the first time I went home, I went up this trail that I hiked with my family, and I just like tears started coming to my eyes. Like it just brought back all these emotions, and that's like a pretty typical thing that we see with users is they go home and they're not expecting these feelings, or they haven't been there in 7 years or something, which is a really cool thing. Like it was very unexpected to create a product that did that.
I like going back to my university in Seattle. It was beautiful brick, red stone buildings, and going back there really reminds me of my time in college and seeing all my friends there. So it's really a unique opportunity to be able to step into a virtual world that simulates an experience you had in real life so similarly. Yeah.
I think for me, actually, my favorite thing is to watch people that come visit us from all around the world to kind of show us their travels in VR. So they'll go in there like, oh, this is the place where I stayed in Colombia, or this is where I was in like Berlin and this and that. And they'd actually tell us their entire life stories. Like we catch up all just them showing us things like Street View or places they've been in the world, and stories that are related to that. So that's really interesting.
I think we have about 2 minutes to open it up for Q&A. Does anybody have any questions? No?
Great product, first of all. My question is, so looking back on the testing process that you did, if there was one thing, knowing what you know now, you would do differently, what might that be?
I mean, I think developing a kind of a solid set of heuristics when it comes to VR design. I mean, it's fairly new at the moment, so I think this is going to take a little bit of time to kind of really determine that. But I think something like that, like a set of heuristics, would help us move a lot faster in the early phases, and be able to kind of evaluate these things much more broadly. Like go through many more ideas currently what we have to do is actually prototype a lot of our ideas just to feel how it's like, just to see how it's like. This is where like Nadav comes in and adds a bunch of parameters to tweak and tune and things like that. So we spend a lot of time on those types of things where I think we could move a lot faster if we had a set of heuristics.
So when you guys plan the development, how you guys plan out the phases? Like you guys start with maybe like the hardest part of the technology, or you kind of like start with some like popular cities?
What was the first part of the question?
So like how you plan out the phase, the deliver like by phase the development? Like how you guys like plan out phase? Like phase 1, what are you gonna do? Phase 2, what are we gonna do?
Oh, you mean before we launched, or like?
Yeah.
We had a few simultaneous things going on. One is we were like getting Google Earth to work in VR, and early on it just wasn't, the frame rate wasn't high, so there's that technical development. And then it was really just a matter of like, we need easy ways to get around, so we started prototyping, and we'd get a few of those, user test them, and then we just keep iterating. So for about a good year, we were in that same loop, just like trying so many different ways of doing the same thing, essentially, until we landed on something that was solid.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you.